Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. My guest today is Steve Rosen, who talks about his long-awaited book titled Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. First of all, believe it or not, cassettes are making a comeback. Yeah, we thought cassettes were left for dead, and vinyl was the way of the future. But vinyl sales and vinyl production is kind of plateauing a little bit. Not cassettes, though. In 2015, there were only 81,000 that were made the entire year in the United States. Last year, 44,000, and that represents a 443% increase. Now, take that with a grain of salt, considering that in 1988, there were 450 million cassettes that were manufactured. That said, Taylor Swift, Maren Morris, My Morning Jacket, Megan Thee Stallion, and other major artists now feature new releases on cassettes. Not only that, we have reissues by Tupac and Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and a host of others. But there are problems. Just like in vinyl, they're not making any more new pressers, so you have to take the old machines and refurb them. That's exactly what's happening with cassette replicators. So what that means is, even if this catches on in a big way, it's not going to be that easy to ramp up really fast. Now, like I said before, cassettes never really went away because there was always a market in religious and instructional and even the Library of Congress. So they were always around, at least to some degree, but now even the major labels are getting interested again. They're not expensive. They cost between $3 and $7 to make, and the runs typically go from about 200 to 1,000, and the minimum is usually about 50. There's even a resurgence of cassette-only labels. Again, in 2015, this seemed to be a big thing, and then they kind of lost favor, and now they're back again. So, a younger generation of music consumers have discovered how much they love the sound of cassettes. Artists find that they're cheap and fast to make for merch, and that means that cassettes might soon become a new revenue source for the music business. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. Also, I'm pleased to announce that the 5th edition of my Mixing Engineer's Handbook is now available. It's totally updated and includes new sections on mixing and immersive audio, self-mastering, new mixer interviews, and much more. Get your copy at a special discounted price at bobbyowsinski.com/handbook. That's bobbyowsinski.com/handbook. You can also find it on Amazon and Apple Books. And remember, you can learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news when you sign up for my newsletter at bobbyowsinski.com. There you'll also find out about openings for my latest online classes and special events. That's bobbyowsinski.com. Now, don't be surprised if the next audio gear or guitar or musical instrument that you want to buy costs more. And believe it or not, it really doesn't have anything to do with inflation. All this manufacturing is starting to move away from China, where it's been cheap for a long, long time. Now, consider that in 2022, about 50% of all musical instrument products that came through the U.S. distribution channel were made in China. Chinese factories accounted for 60% of the global acoustic guitar production, 63% of wind instrument production, 95% of bowed string instrument production, 49% of electronic keyboards, and 59% of microphone and loudspeaker production. That's only part of the story. The components that include magnets for microphones and loudspeakers and pickups and resistors and vacuum tubes for amplifiers, piano keys and screws and connector wires, plastic extrusions, countless other critical parts for musical instruments and audio gear, they're all imported into the States and assembled into products, but guess what? They're coming from China. Now, the fact of the matter is that musical instrument manufacturers have always tried to make things cheaper, and I guess you can say that for just about every manufacturer. But this started back in 1881, believe it or not. Steinway & Sons, the grand piano makers, moved its factory from Manhattan to Long Island City because of militant union organizers. Then we found that manufacturers moved to the southern states because labor was cheaper. Then they moved to Japan, then Korea, then Taiwan, and finally to China, where that's kind of been a home for MI and audio manufacturing for the last 20 years or so. That being said, just about every manufacturer is looking for a new place to manufacture, and a lot of that has to do with the Chinese government's zero-tolerance COVID lockdowns that disrupted the supply chain for at least the last couple of years. Vietnam is a pretty good candidate. It has much lower costs for labor, but it has very primitive infrastructure, and there are tariffs on raw materials or components that were sourced out of the country. India is another good one, and it has a large population, and not only that, an educated workforce, but there's a lot of red tape and a lot of regulations that really stopping manufacturing from going there. Mexico would be ideal because of the proximity to the North American market, and it has lower costs, but again, limited infrastructure, and there's a lot of government corruption. There are some possibilities, though. Indonesia is already a major producer of guitars and pianos, and Malaysia has a thriving electronics business. Problem is that they both currently lack the scale that China has. That being said, don't be surprised if the cost of instruments and audio electronics begin to rise pretty soon. But the cause won't be inflation. It's the musical instrument industry looking for a new manufacturing home. My guest this week is Steve Rosen, who's an esteemed rock journalist who's written for Guitar World, Guitar Player, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Classic Rock, among many others, and he's written books on Jeff Beck, Free and Bad Company, Black Sabbath, Bruce Springsteen, and Prince. His latest book is entitled Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen, and it looks at his long friendship with the guitar god before he was famous until his death. Steve spent many hours with Edward at his Hollywood Hills guest house, up at Van Halen's 5150 studio, on airplanes, in cars, and even jamming with Ed on several occasions. During the interview, we spoke about meeting Edward Van Halen before he was famous, jamming with the master, how he was misunderstood, his multiple personalities, going with him to NAMM shows, and much more. I spoke with Steve via Zoom from his home in Los Angeles. I'd like to know what you were doing before you get into rock journalism.
I had just, I'd actually gone to UCLA. I'd gone, to the UC here. I suppose I wanted to pursue something in English. To be honest, I wanted to be a guitar player in a rock and roll band. And I'd played in bands, since I was very young and played with buddies around, and doing covers and stuff. And I actually started writing songs pretty early. And that's really what I wanted to do. I always loved music. I loved writing. I loved reading. And I thought, well, maybe I can find a way into the music thing by maybe writing about it, by maybe interviewing some of these people and, hanging out with managers and A&R people. And that was, one of the reasons for getting into the journalism thing. But at the heart of it, I wanted to play guitar and be a songwriter, and play in bands. I always thought I was a pretty good guitar player. I wasn't amazing. I didn't have, the gifts of obviously Edward or any of those people I'd go on to interview, but I was pretty good. I understood theory and I thought my melodies and stuff were good. And I thought I could make a living at it. And it just was a truly difficult thing to do. I kept playing and putting bands together. And, back in the day, it was like sending out a cassette, it's like, calling somebody or sending out a letter. Hey, are you listening? Can I send you some songs? And the response is, for the most part, being pretty positive. Yeah, we like what you're doing. Send us, some new stuff. And you send them new stuff and it'd be like, okay, man, yeah, that's really good. Let us know what you're doing next. And, I could just never get that nibble from a publisher or a label or, and in the meantime, I sort of began the music journalism thing and doors were opening that way. And I was, in the same room with managers and, talking to musicians and stuff. And I thought that was, like I said, that would be a way in and hanging out at, publicists' offices for all the labels. And, it's funny, man, you're a journalist first and you're a musician second, and it's like that saying, those who can't teach. I mean, it's really not true, but I almost found it more difficult to convince people. Look, man, I really do play guitar and I can write, and the journalism was just a way in. Anyway, so that's kind of what I was doing beforehand. I wrote for the paper at the Bruin, the Daily Bruin, and that was great. But the end line, man, was always wanting to play guitar and be a songwriter and do that.
What was your first gig as a writer?
My first gig as a writer was getting a review. I remember the review. It was T-Rex playing at the Hollywood Palladium here on Sunset Boulevard in a little local softcore porn newspaper called the LA Star. And I call it softcore porn, not because it had any kind of nasty pictures in it, but because the back of the newspaper were all the massage ads, And so, you'd put your quarter in it was one of those, periodicals. You put the quarter in the vending machine and, pull it up and you pull out your copy. I had been sending, reviews out everywhere because I obviously wasn't able to do any interviews. I mean, you needed the management, you needed publicists to do that. I couldn't just go and do an interview with, Peter Frampton. I mean, it wasn't going to happen. So I thought, well, I go to concerts, I do reviews, and I send reviews everywhere, man. I was sending them to, Guitar Player, which is a dumb thing because Guitar Player didn't run live reviews. Yeah. But I did get something back from Jim Crockett, the editor, who said, wow, we like the writing, we don't run live reviews, but, keep us in mind, And I thought, wow, that's cool. And, I sent them to Cream and Circus, and they all passed. And, one day I get a copy of the LA Star. I was still living at home with my parents in the mail. And I'm going, what is this? I open it up and I'm looking through, and there's my little byline for my, review for the T-Rex. This guy, Mark Yandel, the music editor, had printed it. And that was like a joyous moment, man. It's like, obviously there was no money involved and nobody saw that review but me. But at that point in time, man, I was Hunter Thompson and I was John Steinbeck, man. I was like, that's all I need.
Yeah, but you were published.
Exactly, man. I tell you, seeing your name, it was unbelievable, and you're always, and I went on to do some great things, but it was never quite that feeling of that first one, it was different feelings, but that first one was amazing. So, that was the first thing, the LA Star. Then I got something in the LA Free Press, which is a pretty established, it was like an underground newspaper, you may know about it. There was like the Free Press bookstore, which I love to go to, which was like on Fairfax, the Fairfax area, which is like the very Orthodox Jew area, man. But, amongst all these shops selling, menorahs and, all this Jewish paraphernalia was the LA Free Press, and they had like the black light posters, man. And, it was like a counterculture thing. And I just loved going there. So, having a little, and again, it was a live review, having a review printed in the Free Press was amazing, And now when they paid me $20 for it, I thought, oh my God, I'm rich now. So those were fun days, man.
Okay, so finally you start to write for magazines. Yeah. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, it becomes a real stepping stone thing, so the LA Star, though no one saw it, it's like, it was a byline, So I don't know if I made Xeroxes of it, but I then would send that out to like all the record labels. Hey, look, I'm a writer, I'm published, and I hear nothing back, But then the Free Press story comes out, and Free Press carries a little bit of weight. So I did the same thing. And some of the labels said, "Hey, we'll keep you in mind next time. We have some tickets for shows." And then you now approach these same magazines, Cream and Circus, and say, "Look, I've got a couple of bylines, and maybe they had tossed me some little story on I don't know. I can't remember who those early interviews were with. But yeah, man, it was just a stepping stone thing, and getting on the list for the labels to receive the records. I'm now receiving records, so I can do reviews, and I can call them up now and get concert tickets, and I can now contact a magazine. Hey, look, Wild Turkey is coming to town, and I'm going to interview him. Can you guys use a story? Yeah, we could use a story. Send it to us. We'll see. So, you just try to connect those dots with the publicists and management, and then the magazines, and, you get one thing printed, and then that leads to hopefully a publication in a better magazine. Those are really fun days, man. Though they were really challenging, and every one of those magazines turned me down, and they send their stuff back. Wow, it's really not what we write, what we run, and and it's like you cringe when you get those things, but it's like, at least they're looking at this stuff, at least they're reading it, and it's the stupidity of youth. It's like, well, you don't know any better, so you just, you bang your head against the next door, and it opens a little bit more, and but those are fun days, man. The 70s as a freelance journalist, man, those were fun days.
Let's jump up to guitar player.
Guitar player came about through Gibson and Stromberg. Gibson and Stromberg were the only, I believe at the time, rock and roll publicity company. I mean, later, you had, Rogers and Cowan. And, there were tons of them. It was big business. But back then, you had nobody, doing publicity for rock and roll bands. And they were around first, I believe. So they were handling Jeff Beck. They were doing the Stones, or at least live Stones. That band I mentioned earlier, Wild Turkey, which had one of the members from Jethro Tull, Ben Cornick, the bass player, Steely Dan, Dr. Hook, Sutherland Brothers and Quiver, English band. They just had this amazing roster of artists, and I cannot remember how I was introduced to them, but they took me under their wing, and this is probably like late 72, early 73, and they just saw me as this new kid on the street, man, and they just took me under their wing, and they opened every door, and they made every one of their acts accessible to me, and they got me Stones tickets. I didn't quite get a Stones interview, but I did get tickets to the, see the Stones out here. But I interviewed all those bands. And a lot of those bands, honestly, I didn't particularly care for, but I knew, hey, if I go and interview Dr. Hook, they're going to hook me up with Steely Dan or something like that. And that's what it was. And they just really took care of me. So I remember being in Lydia Woltab, one of the publicists there, who was really the main person I was dealing with, and the one who really opened all the doors for me. And we were talking. They handled Jeff Beck, as I mentioned. And she said, oh, would you like to interview Jeff Beck? And I said, oh, my God, are you kidding? He's my favorite guitar player in the world, still is. I said, I'd give anything to interview Jeff Beck. She goes, well, let me see if I can set that up. So I'm there in the office. She gets on the phone, calls Jim Crockett, the editor for Guitar Player, while I'm sitting there. Goes, hi, Jim, Lydia, and I've got this writer, and he's going to be interviewing Jeff Beck, and do you think you could use a story? And so she's talking, and, I can't hear what is going on the other side of the conversation. And she gets off the phone. She goes, yeah, he'll read it. He says, you do it, you send it to him, and if he likes it, he'll run it. And so she set it up, and I went and interviewed Jeff at the Continental Hyatt House. This must be mid-June, July, August, 73. And I was terrified out of my mind. And I'd been writing for a little while at that point, but interviewing Jeff Beck, that was it for me. I played, shapes of things and cover bands and Yardbird songs. We did the interview, and it came out what I thought it came out great. I remember sending it to Jim Crockett, and getting a letter and saying, this is perfect. We love this. It's going to be a cover.
Wow.
So my very first story for Guitar Player turned out to be a cover of December 73. And that was the beginning of a relationship that lasted 73, I think, till 78, about 5 years. I ended up doing 16 covers for them, which turned out to be like a cover story every 5 months. I was like the main freelancer for them. And yeah, that was amazing. That opened up all kinds of doors. Through them, I interviewed, Page, and went on the road with Zeppelin, and, Joe Walsh and John Entwistle and Wishbone Ash, or one of my very favorite bands, Ritchie Blackmore. I mean, that was an amazing time. At the time, I mean, there weren't a lot of guitar magazines around. Guitar World came out in, I think their first year of publication was 81 or 82. So, I mean, if you were a guitar player, you wanted to be in Guitar Player magazine. And I was like the guy, I was like, they knew, and I was doing interviews with them, potentially it's a cover story. And, I had a lot of weight, I carried a lot of weight. I had a lot of weight behind me, man. Those were just really fun days. I love doing that stuff with Guitar Player.
Let's jump up to Edward Van Halen.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did you meet him initially? Because you had a long relationship with him.
Long relationship. Well, funny, we're talking about Guitar Player magazine. I never interviewed Ed for Guitar Player. By the time I sort of met Ed in 77, my days at Guitar Player were kind of waning, and Jazz Obrecht, who came in as like a featured editor, Jazz started doing all the interviews with Eddie, and he did some fantastic interviews. I was at the Whiskey one night. Cheap Trick was recording a live record, and I went to the Whiskey a lot back in the day. I mean, a lot. I mean, 3 or 4 days a week on average. I mean, I was there all the time. So to go and honestly, see another band, it was like, I don't know. And, I mean, at that point in time, the labels were like, well, what can we do for you? I mean, we'll give you a free tab, we'll give you free tickets, and, we'll buy you a hamburger. I mean, it was just unbelievable. They would bend over backwards, T-shirts and, coffee mugs. I mean, it was just an amazing time back then. But it's like, I don't really want to go to the Whiskey again. But it was like Cheap Trick recording a live record. That's worth seeing. So I took my brother, and I was living up in Laurel Canyon at the time on a street called Weepaw Way, where Edward visited many times, and drove down to the Whiskey, which is literally 10 minutes away. And we were standing downstairs waiting for Cheap Trick to come on, and somebody taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Michelle Meyer. Michelle booked the club, and she also booked some other clubs around town. We talked earlier about me being a guitar player. I had a band at the time called Deluge, and, we were trying to, play wherever we could. And she had booked us into Madame Wong's East and West, these clubs she booked, which were pretty heavy clubs. I mean,
I remember them well, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
For punk bands, you wanted to play there.
Yeah.
I mean, we weren't a punk band. I mean, I fancied myself, I don't know, somewhere between like I don't know, wishfully thinking, Tom Petty, Peter Frampton. I mean, it was pretty melodic. I had another guitar player. But, I mean, she'd never heard the band, and she booked us into those clubs. So I was instantly her lifelong friend. I love Michelle. She was amazing. She was all things guitar, anything worth happening in Hollywood she knew about. She taps on the shoulder and says, listen, there's somebody upstairs, I want you to meet. He's Godhead. And that's her vernacular for beyond mortal. If she dubbed you Godhead, you were the elite of the elite. So we walk upstairs to the dressing rooms up the Whiskey, which are dumps. They reek of cigarettes, and the floors are littered with cigarettes, and the walls are covered with the graffiti of bands. Which, if that graffiti is still there, I mean, there's probably some famous stuff up there.
Yeah.
But just really kind of dumpy little rooms, and off to the in the corner is this guy, and he's smoking a cigarette, and we walk over, and he obviously, whoever this person was, had recognized Michelle, and she says, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen, Godhead, and he smiled, so obviously he knew what the term meant. And, I don't remember if she just described me as, a writer or just, left the room at that point. I said, "Hey man, hi. I must have said that, I write for, guitar magazines and stuff, and we just started talking. And that's how it started. I mean, the things that are so hard to remember is one, I know that I had never seen him play at that point. And I think that was a huge part of this, this connection thing that happened. I mean, by that time, by 77, I mean, I'd interviewed some heavy guys, right? I'd interviewed Beck, I'd interviewed Blackmore, John McLaughlin, Dave Mason. I mean, some amazing guitar players. So I was still in awe of these guys, but it wasn't quite so much the nerd thing and, oh my God, So I don't think I would have been like that had I known what a remarkable player he was. But, I'm sure it would have crept in. But not knowing how he played, I think that was like, I was just talking to another guitar player from the Strip, a guitar player whose band had just signed a big deal on Warner Brothers Records, and no other Strip band had done that. So that was pretty remarkable in and of itself. And I'm thinking, my God, I can barely get a gig at some little club, and here's this guy, my God, he's got a deal on Warner Brothers. To me, that was an unfathomable goal, and he had reached it. And, we talked about that, and he was just so unassuming about all of it, but just so open, we talked about Clapton and Cream was like, Clapton with Cream was like one of that was it for me, and we talked about Blackmore, who I loved. And it was just an amazing conversation, it was one of those conversations that I'd like to describe it as, it had begun somewhere earlier, and you're just continuing the conversation here, right? Spiritually.
Yeah.
It was just really comfortable, and I knew that he knew a lot about music, because I talked to guys who would, confess to knowing, I know a lot about Blackmore, and, and they'd make one comment, and I'd be like, oh, not that it was stupid, it was an obvious comment, and me being the guitar snob, it's like, dude, you don't know anything. I wouldn't say that to him, but his insights into Richie's playing, and the vibrato bar stuff it was amazing. At the end of the night, he gave me his phone number, and hey man, call me. I hope we talk again. And that was the beginning of it. I never in a million years, I never thought that the friendship, I figured I'd probably run into him again, that I'd probably interview him again. Hey, he's on Warner's, I'm interviewing Warner's bands. We crossed paths like that, but I never had a sense, honestly, that it would turn into what it did. I hoped it would. I hope that I was going to meet him again because he was such a good guy. But I never really had any idea.
Let's jump up to the book then.
Yeah.
Let's start with the name, Tonechaser. How did you come up with that? Was it Eddie always chasing tone? Because I thought he had it and that was his tone.
Yeah, right. Well, I think a lot of people thought that. And Ed would describe that as the Brown sound. And, yes, I believe Ed was always chasing tone. If I may be so bold, just happen to have a copy.
Oh, yeah.
But on the inside is, the first major kind of photo you see. And I did want to give a shout out to my good friend, Niels Lozauer, who shot this amazing cover, shot this one. This is in July 78 from the Day on the Green. And obviously you can tell it's the same session as the cover. Neil, for anyone who may not know, was Van Halen's, official, unofficial photographer from, kind of day one, I believe, until 84. So Edward, in one of the last interviews we ever did, and I'm quoting, this is the quote I pulled here, "I'm a tone chaser and I'm always chasing tone. It's that elusive thing you hear in your head that you just can't quite get." Yeah, so I'd ask him, I go, what keeps you going? And that was his response. So no, he never found that, and that's why he was who he was. And that's why, always the experimentation. So the second that came out of his mouth, I said to myself, well, I take that back. He said that to me around 2003. When I began the book in 2020, I was coming up with names. And I actually had I'd written down some potential names, and I posted them blood, frets, and gears. A life was this, trying to be poetic, and it's like what the, and then I don't know, somehow I thought, oh my God, Tonechaser, that's it, or actually it may have been as I was working through the book, and I came up on that interview because I would work off the interviews. I try to work chronologically, and when I came to that, which is one of the final interviews we did, I heard Tonechaser, and I go, oh my God, that's it, that's who Edward was. And Tonechaser is one word, and I must give credit for that to Daniel Gray, who's the art director. I had it as two words. Tonechaser, is sort of as one word. I mean, that's who Edward was.
Yeah, it works better.
Exactly. There you go.
You had a long relationship with him, but it was more than just doing interviews, right?
It was. I mean, in some respects, and that's a really good question. If I think about it, yeah, there were interviews, but certainly the friendship was not based on the interviews whatsoever. And yeah, there was a lot more time spent in non-interviews than there were in interviews. Yeah. There were a lot of conversations that were recorded because I asked him at one point, let me digress for 2 minutes here. In 1985, I was going to write Edward's authorized biography. We talked. He says, yeah, man, no one else could write it but you. We signed a simple little contract. He actually gave me some money. So from that point forward, I tried to record everything I could. Even then, I missed a lot. It's not like I could walk around with a microphone in my, you know what I mean? And even though he wouldn't have minded, there's just no way I could have done that. So I tended to record a lot of stuff. And he goes, yeah, man, record anything you want. So a lot of the times I was recording were just conversations between us. And in the book, I talk about these conversations. I call them the twilight tapes, because he'd usually call me very late at night, early in the morning, and he'd want to talk. And it would be about music sometimes not. But these weren't interviews. These were just conversations. And there were many more of those in the interview thing. But beyond that, it was just a lot of time, spent watching him play guitar, or, there were some moments we jammed together, which were just,
What was that like?
Honestly, man, and I'm not trying to over romanticize it, but you were in the presence of somebody truly, truly remarkable. And again, I'd been in the presence of a lot of those people, and I'd been with them when they were playing, or they'd be warming up before the show. And look, I've been up close and watched Steve Vai, and it's insane. And I interviewed Jeff Beck that first time. And I actually brought a guitar and I watched him play, and that was spectacular, And watching Edward, maybe because I knew him so well, it was watching Da Vinci and John Steinbeck writing East of Eden, and it was something unbelievable. And we all know how great he was, and I knew how great he was, and we heard him on record, and we watched him in concert. But you watch somebody up close, not plugged in, and you can actually watch his hands, and you watch how he holds the pick, and it's beyond description. I tried to describe those things. So what was it like jamming with him? Honestly, it was trying not to gag. It was trying not to hyperventilate. And again, I'm not trying to be over dramatic. It's just trying to, keep cool, because whenever I would go to that place, he didn't like it. And maybe I would have said something like, Ed, I can't jam with you. He said, just play guitar, man, and he would diffuse the situation, or he'd diffuse it as much as he could. So, I'd start playing a riff, and then, he'd be playing bass, and we'd just start playing, and you try to forget who's, 3 feet away from you playing bass. And it was amazing. And I could see how he would be with the band, and how he'd try to draw things out of them, and not trying in any way to put himself up on this pedestal. I think he wanted the best with whomever he was playing with, and I believe he was able to, or at least he tried to draw that out. So those were amazing experiences. I can still feel what that's like, sitting there with him.
Do you think he was misunderstood?
I think he was incredibly misunderstood. On some levels, Edward, and I had the question, did Ed have multi personalities? Absolutely. Not in any socio-strange way, but he was one person as a husband. He was one person, later as a father. He was one person as a brother. He was one person as a band leader. He was one person as my friend. On some levels, he was a very simple, basic guy. I came to believe, and I'm pretty positive it's true, that was all about respect with Edward, and that you could criticize him, say, "Hey man, that's not right," or I don't like that solo, Ed, you can do better. But if it came from a disrespectful place, then he shut off, or he'd get pretty angry. Ed could get pretty mad. I mean, I never saw him lose his temper. Honestly, he got pretty angry with me at times. It was intimidating. So, yeah, I think people looking from the outside, Edward Van Halen, this extraordinary looking guy. I mean, he was fit. He had beautiful hair and a beautiful face and a smile, and the clothes fell on him perfectly. And he was in a successful band. And he was writing. It's like Edward Van Halen had no problems in his life. Trust me, Edward had problems. Maybe not like you and me, not money problems specifically, but he thought about things, and he had, emotional things going on with his family and the band. Yeah, I think he was really misunderstood. What makes me really sad, one, about, I don't want to give away too much about the book, but, the way the relationship ended up. But beyond that, there was so much more I wanted to talk to him about. I wrote 580 pages. I mean, there were 1,000 pages in me, and you asked me this question, was he misunderstood? I wanted to talk to him about these things I had talked about in depth. I wanted to talk to him about his relationships with his family, with his mother, with his father. Those were different kinds of relationships. With Al, and then with Wolf and his marriages, and really heavy stuff that we only touched on, like I said, in some of these Twilight tape conversations. But now that stuff's gone forever.
Yeah.
I mean, Al, may have some memories, and but that's coming from Al. But certainly he's probably the closest. I mean, then Valerie, and then Wolf. But obviously Wolf was born much later, so he doesn't know about those first years of Edward's life. So yeah, that stuff is gone forever. The parents are gone. I don't know if he has any relatives, that remember him. Yeah. So yeah, that's the sad thing,
Did he ever mention which version of the band he liked best?
He never, that's a good question. He never said that to me, and I never asked him. I can tell you that being with him over the course of the David Lee Roth era, and then the Sammy era, and then into the, Gary Sharon album, as it were, there was no doubt in my mind that he was most happy with the David Lee Roth band, which isn't to say that he didn't have extraordinary problems and, emotional stuff going on with all those guys early on. But I know those first 2-3 records, he was happiest. I saw it when I was with him, those were virgin days for him, right? He was this kid, playing in the Sunset Strip band, and he was now out on the road and playing with Sabbath, and he had played Sabbath songs, during the cover days of Gazzari's, he was touring, he had an album out, his writing was being exposed, the world was coming to learn who this kid was. I know that he was most joyous, most joyful, those early days. Which band was he happiest with? I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
You went with them to NAMM shows as well, and that's always interesting because the attention big-time music celebrity gets at NAMM, and just being in that circle is interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, the NAMM shows were something else. Honestly, I'm still shocked and surprised that Edward ever agreed to do those NAMM shows. And again, I write about it in the book. When he signed with Kramer, I thought that was the biggest mistake that he could have made. Yeah, why do that? You're Edward Van Halen. You could have them make guitars for you. You can maybe tell people you play Kramer or not. But he signed with them. And maybe, one of the caveats look, I'm only hypothesizing here. Maybe one of the, conditions was, you do convention appearances for us. Why he would ever do that, I don't know, because he eschewed interviews. He didn't like doing them. He did not like that focus or attention on them. And that's basically, sitting in a room, with one other guy, not me necessarily, but one, a journalist doing that. The NAMM show, man, that's a different beast. I don't know why he ever did those. I was with him at 2, maybe 3, and I've never seen a more uncomfortable Edward Van Halen in my life. I saw it, and he tried to put the smile on and people come up and Eddie signed this and Eddie signed that, and I knew his body language well enough, and he'd be there with a cigarette, and he'd be slouched and he'd write something and he'd toss it out there, and he was drinking his beer. He was unhappy. And then I write about, one NAMM show, and again, I don't want to give that away, where he was extraordinarily depressed. And that was horrible. I'd never seen him in that condition. And earlier that day, he had been at my pad. He had been on Weepo Way, and he was totally cool. And from that point in the morning till whatever that was, late afternoon, when he was there at that NAMM show at the Kramer booth, man, he changed. I don't know why he did it.
I can remember being at Summer NAMM, when they used to have it in Chicago at McCormick Place.
Yeah.
And I was working for a company then, and McCormick Place is huge, and it's sort of on a slope. And I remember looking down the walkway, and it looked like a tsunami was coming down.
Mm-hmm.
There was all these people, and it kept on getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it came towards me. And finally, I saw exactly why. And it was Ed and Valerie. This was early in the days when they were together. And it was this, celebrity power couple. But the enormity of the response and just the tail on the number of people that were following along was amazing.
Yeah. In fact, the first NAMM show, I can't remember, that was like 85, 86. I can't remember. But the same thing happened. I went with Ed. We drove down from 5150, and literally the second he walked in the NAMM doors, there was a buzz. I don't know how people, and by the time he reached the Kramer booth, I describe it as the Pied Piper. Yep. I've never seen anything like it. And there were some heavy people, as you well know, some heavy people go to the NAMM because they're there, they're endorsing gear, and the manufacturers, have them out there. So, I've been there, Stevie Wonder, Jeff Beck, and I've never seen that type of thing happen. Yeah, Ed was beyond the rock guy thing. He was, I don't know what he was, man. It was a legend. He was, people loved him. They adored him. Look, people loved Jimmy Page and those kinds of people, but it was different. That adulation for those guys, I think, stemmed from them as musicians. With Ed, it went beyond him being a guitar player. Of course, that's where it emanated from. But they just loved him as this human being. I don't know how to describe it. I saw it a lot.
One last question for you, Steve. What prompted you to finally write the book?
I'd like to think I had a really definitive answer for you. I had been... friends had said along the way, man, you should write the book. You were supposed to do the book back in the day. You should write the book. And I kept avoiding that. I thought, honestly, the amount of work it would take to go through all the interviews and put it all together and figure out the chronology and organize everything. I thought, I can't do it. I'm not up to that, So that was a huge part of it. And there was another part of it where I thought I didn't feel up to the task. I didn't feel like Stephen Rosen, as a writer, was good enough to write this book about Edward Van Halen, the guitar player. I thought that I would fall short, that what I would write would just be a shadow of who he was, And I thought, my God, if I think I'm going to write that kind of a book, don't write it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to look at it and go, what a piece of shit, and toss it in the garbage. So, it was those things. Ultimately, I think I said to myself, look, man, you have to write this book. And not for fans, though obviously that was a huge part of it. I did have this relationship that no other writer had, and maybe I had this little window that fans maybe wanted to look through. So yes, it was for them. Mainly it was kind of for myself. I didn't want to, say 10 years from now, you know what, man, you should have written that book. That was a chicken's way out, So you write a book and it doesn't come out good. You don't put it out or you whatever, but you have to write that book. And I think that's ultimately what it was, kind of a.
Did you know he was ill?
I did. I didn't know he was that ill. I had actually, and I write about the book, I had reached out to him a few years earlier, and I hadn't spoken to him in years. And it was first I sent an email, I hadn't heard anything. I got his phone number. I had a phone number that was no longer in use. I had another phone number, and hi, this is Edward. And I got, I heard his voice the first time in years. It was his answering machine. So I left the message, Ed, we haven't spoken for years. Hey, man, I miss you. I hope you're okay. And I never heard that. No, I didn't know he was that ill when I began the book. I did start the book on August 24th. I remember that because it was my birthday. I thought, well, I'm going to start it. Let's start it today. And Edward passed away October. I'm sorry, I forget the exact day in October. So it was, several weeks before he passed away in 2020. But no, I had no idea he was that sick.
Where can people get the book, Steve?
People can get the book in several places. You can get it on Amazon, Reverb, or Etsy. And if you just go to any of those sites and just type in Tonechaser and Steve Rosen, it will come up. Or you can get the book directly from me through PayPal. And that link is paypal.me/Tonechaser. PayPal.me/Tonechaser. And if you're in the U.S., it's $47. And if you're international, just go find my Facebook page and I can give you some shipping rates because it's different everywhere. I'm really proud of the book. And, I think Van Halen fans so far, the responses I've gotten have been pretty amazing. So, I think you guys should check it out.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. Remember that you can learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news when you sign up for my newsletter at bobbyowsinski.com. There you'll also find out about openings for my latest online classes and special events. That's bobbyowsinski.com. To listen to the episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to bobbyowsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to bobbyowinnercircle.com, or you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, TuneIn Radio, Radio Public, and Podbean. At bobbyowsinski.com and bobbyowinnercircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.